January is always a difficult month for space historians as it contains the anniversary of some of our darkest days. And this week, it's been 20 years since the Space Shuttle Columbia broke up on re-entry, killing the 7 astronauts on board.
So, to mark this, today we're talking to Jonathan Ward, the co-writer of the award-winning book, Bringing Columbia Home.
If you have anything you'd like to share with us about this episode, please do so via our social media pages at Space and Things 1 on Twitter and at Space and Things Podcast on Instagram and Facebook, or via the contact form on our website.
But right now, this is episode 126 of the Space and Things podcast.
Oh my God! Unbelievable, but it is great to touch.
You are listening to Space and Things with Dave Giles and Emily Carney.
I'm Emily Carney.
And I'm Dave Giles, and welcome to episode 126 of the Space and Things podcast. Before we get started, Emily, I meant to talk about this a couple of weeks ago. Did I see you doing something at the American Space Museum in Titusville?
I think we got mentioned in the live stream for them because I came by the museum a few weeks ago and I just hung out there. I love the American Space Museum.
It's such a cool place.
I will give them a shout out any time of the day because they're just amazing. I love what they do. They're a smaller, more community museum. They're not like a big Smithsonian style museum, but I think that's actually pretty awesome in itself because it's very oriented around the community and like Titusville and the Space Coast and stuff like that. So it's really cool. But yeah, they gave us a shout out on their Stay Curious show, and I did go visit there a few weeks ago just to hang out. I love hanging out there, and I want to give a shout out to Mark as well. Mark Marquette, I believe he's the community liaison there. He does a spectacular job.
We'll get him on at some point. I think that's a great idea.
Yes.
Anyone who's ever planning a visit to KSC, obviously Kennedy Space Center is amazing, but just over the water, over the bridges in Titusville is this wonderful little museum which has got amazing artifacts, and the people in there are amazing. You can talk to any of them in there, and they've got great stories and they know their stuff. So definitely get over there. Okay. So this is one of those episodes which is always difficult to know how to do. So hopefully we will get the tone right. 20 years ago, on the 1st of February 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated over Texas as it attempted re-entry, and the 7 astronauts on board were killed. What followed was the largest ground search operation in US history, and a post-flight investigation discovered that a piece of foam which broke off the external tank when the shuttle launched had severely damaged the left wing of Columbia, which caused the fatal accident. Bringing Columbia Home is the inside story of the disaster and the recovery, and how the darkest hours can bring out the best of people. The book won the Space Hipsters Book Prize for the best book released in 2018.
Today, we're joined by Jonathan Ward, one of the co-authors of that book. We previously had Jonathan on the podcast along with astronaut Eileen Collins as he co-authored her incredible book, which came out a couple of years back now, and that is also worth checking out. Jonathan wrote Bringing Columbia Home with Michael D. Leinbach, who was the last launch director in the Space Shuttle program at Kennedy Space Center, and who was responsible for overall shuttle countdown activities until the end of the program in 2011. Quoting the back of the book, Jonathan works to bring the thrill of the space program to life for the general public as a solar system ambassador for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society. He is the author of 2 previous books on space exploration, Countdown to a Moon Launch, Preparing Apollo for its Historic Journey, and Rocket Ranch, the nuts and bolts of the Apollo moon program at Kennedy Space Center. So let's talk to the excellent Jonathan Ward.
The very first night we were up there, just before we went to bed, I got to see, I took the time to watch a sunset. And a sunrise happens, and 45 minutes later the sun sets. And then the sunrise 45 minutes later, and then the sun sets. Well, this one, just before we went to bed, we took time to look at it. And I felt quite humbled by the whole thing, by the fact that here I was finally being allowed to realize this dream that I had had for such a long time. And I can say that I certainly had a great feeling of thankfulness in that.
So welcome back, Jonathan, and thank you for joining us again. So first, let's set the scene. So tell us of the motivation to write the story about Columbia's recovery.
I would have to say, in all honesty, that it was a complete surprise to me that this came up. I was meeting with Mike Leinbach at the funeral of a mutual friend of ours who had been a launch test conductor in the Apollo era. And he always said that Mike was the best person that he ever hired. I never got a chance to meet Mike while Norm was still around. And at Norm's funeral, I recognized Mike, went over and introduced myself and suggested we go out and have a couple of drinks and tell some stories and about our mutual friend. And at the end of that lunch, Mike said, I always wanted to write a book about Columbia, but I never had the discipline to do that. And I had the sense, I guess, to say, well, let's talk about that. And we got together a couple of weeks later and started talking about it. But the original motivation was for Mike to tell the story of his team from Kennedy Space Center that went out to recover debris and then come back and put it together. So that was the original motivation for the story. And then the story grew as we got farther and farther into it.
And why do you think so many people banded together to recover this space shuttle and its crew? Many who perhaps didn't even have an interest in spaceflight at that time.
That's what's one of the really fascinating things about this. And we, of course, telling the story of Mike's team, this was people who all worked at Kennedy Space Center who had worked on Columbia. So they had a natural motivation. But in talking with astronaut Jerry Ross, he said, the real story is out in East Texas where Columbia actually came down. And to them, it was really fascinating. A lot of them didn't even realize there was a space shuttle going overhead that day. And they heard this tremendous explosion, this series of rumbles that went on for 15 to 20 minutes. It was basically 84,000 pieces of the space shuttle breaking the sound barrier and the overlapping sonic booms of all of that. So these people, thought it was everything from a pipeline explosion to trains colliding to jets colliding to the coming of the end of the times, or a nuclear explosion in New Orleans. So, these folks, of course, then as pieces of the shuttle started coming down and as the astronauts were found later that day, the first of the astronauts were found later that day, it became for them something very important for them to do. They seemed to take that very personally, and I think that's one of the most touching things about this story was that it really was people who took personal ownership to try to bring the crew back home with dignity.
So bringing Columbia home deals with tragedy. And I know, as a writer, tragedy is really hard to write about in a way that's tasteful and respectful. And bringing Columbia home really tells the story in a tasteful, respectful manner. And it tells really an oddly hopeful story that has an uplifting side, if that even makes sense. Did you and Mike Leinbach really expect the book to have that tone when you guys first started working on it?
That was actually one of the primary goals for the book. From the very outset, Mike said, I do not want to tell the story about what was going on in the cockpit at the time of the breakup. I don't want to talk about the condition of the astronauts when they were found. We don't need to go into that at all. We need to talk about dealing with the tragedy and dealing with the human side of that. That was one of the things that I guess really impressed me about Mike as being the consummate engineer and the launch director. You figure these are people who were probably not necessarily emotionally with it, but it was extremely compelling in talking with him from the very outset when he talked about the things that he needed to do to give his team emotional space to work during the reconstruction of the shuttle in the hangar, and also the people who were out in the field. He was very, very much in touch with what was going on with those folks and had his pulse on the emotions of his team from the very beginning, and had the right mix of giving people space to do what they needed to do to deal with grief that just popped up at unexpected times, but then also to celebrate things that went well. So, again, we deliberately wanted to make this as tasteful as possible. Mike made that commitment to the crew families that we were going to make this, this was not going to be a salacious book. Of course, that's a question we get a lot. People ask, want to get into the more gory details about things, and we tell them that this is really not what we're here to tell the story about.
Yeah. We've had a couple of questions from some of our patrons, which I feel might fit in here.
Sure.
First of all, from Don, and I feel like this does follow on quite nicely. Don Owen has said, is there a special story from interviewing someone involved in the recovery, NASA or other, that did not make it into the book?
There are a number of stories. It was funny. One of the things that I was reflecting on, probably the biggest complaint that I get about the book is that there are too many people mentioned in there. And, you run into the problem of we only had so many words we were allowed to put in the book. So there were some stories that we just had to leave out because they didn't really advance the story overall. I wish we could have told more. And of course, as soon as the book came out, I meet more and more people who are like, gee, I wish I'd talked to that person because they have another fascinating story to tell. When you have 24,000 people who were involved in this thing, there's going to be stories from everybody. And it's my hope that if you do have a Columbia story that we haven't captured, that you will record that and save that. I'm hoping, that people will use that information to go to the Remembering Columbia Museum in Hemp Hill, Texas. It seems to be a logical repository for a lot of the stories, or else the Apollo Challenger Columbia Lessons Learned program at NASA also collects a lot of this information. But yeah, there were a lot of really touching stories. There were some that were more personally identifiable than others. There were some that were a little too emotionally wrenching. I mean, if you think this one is a story of grief, there were some stories I heard that we just felt we couldn't put in the book just to spare the reader.
Wow.
There are a number of stories out there, but I'm very happy with the ones that did make it into the book.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some real beauts in there. Rachel Franklin has also got in contact, and she said, first of all, thank you for writing such a comprehensive and respectful book about Columbia. I have been able to share the content with my students without worrying of anything inappropriate. Have any new parts, pieces, or debris been recovered in recent years? I have read news stories of new discoveries that may have changed the known facts, but not all seemed credible.
Okay. Yeah, there's nothing that we have found that has changed any of the facts. The latest piece that I'm aware of was a piece of tile that turned up in a farmer's field in Texas. I want to say it was 3 or 4 years ago. He was turning over a field and found a piece of tile. We very, very clearly have found the pieces from around the left wing where the breach in the wing occurred, and so it was very clear that was the cause of the accident. So yeah, there was nothing that would have changed that I'm aware of that would have changed anything. I think there are probably still lots of pieces out there. I mean, there are 6 power heads on the 3 engines. 3 of them have been recovered. 3 of them are still out there buried in the mud somewhere in Louisiana.
Wow. Those
things hit the ground at Mach 2 and buried themselves under probably 15 feet of mud and out in the middle of nowhere. So they may turn up someday.
Yeah.
But it's miraculous that it looks like half of them were recovered.
The most important thing was finding that data recorder box that turned up, basically just sitting out in the middle of nowhere, sitting out in the open, completely pristine. You could still read its property ID tag, and the tape was still intact inside. There was a camera that had been on the belly of the space shuttle, a film camera that had taken pictures of the external tank as it separated, and NASA was trying to find that. And they thought that it might have come down right at the edge of the reservoir there. And so there was a lot of searching that was done for that camera, and that was never recovered.
So the Columbia recovery and subsequent investigation and aftermath was really different from that of Challengers. And if we go even further back, Apollo 1. So as a leadership expert, you also work in that field. Tell us why you think that is.
I think a lot of it has to do with obviously the personality of the people who were involved, the leaders that are involved. I think in past years, and I certainly heard this from even the old hands at Apollo, was that accidents out at the Cape were an embarrassment, and things like that needed to basically just be buried and forgotten about. And there was pressure on Mike to do that as well with Columbia after the reconstruction was done. Let's just put it in a silo like we did with Challenger. There's no need to preserve it. I think the compelling reason that Mike gave for making that material available was because it represented, I think it was 10 times the amount of material that had survived hypersonic reentry that had ever been recovered. So this was a fantastic learning laboratory to have all this material available. It became useful for things like designing the crew helmet interface to the seats on the Orion spacecraft and things like that. So we learned a lot from that debris. There have been 3 PhDs that have been awarded based on studying Columbia debris.
Wow.
And so, Mike is extremely proud of that. And the other thing, of course, is that NASA doesn't make it mandatory, but it's strongly suggested for anybody who comes to work at the Cape that they tour the Columbia reconstruction room to see the debris as a lesson learned for what happens if you make a bad decision, or if you fail to make a decision, or if you don't speak up when something is going on. So this is, they don't require contractors to do it, but they strongly encourage people to go through that and kind of recognize that there are consequences to your actions or lack of actions, no matter what level you are within the organization. Very, very powerful leadership lesson.
Absolutely. Another one of our patrons, Todd Oliver, has sent in a comment which I'm going to add a question to, because I think it does lead on from what Emily just asked. And his comment says this: I only have a comment, which is that Challenger was treated as a national tragedy while the loss of Columbia was largely ignored. I believe that this was due to the fact it was lost on descent, so the loss wasn't televised. I think this allowed the investigation to go under the radar, as the findings were even more damning than Challenger, as NASA had almost lost Atlantis years earlier. Do you think there is a disparity between how the two missions are remembered by the general public? I know if you go to any of the space centers, obviously they're both very much honored with respect equally, in my opinion. But do you think this was largely ignored by the general public?
That's my contention. And it's funny that there's a YouTube video that I recorded from one of the talks that I gave at Space Fest. And I start off by saying that most people don't remember Columbia. And I get a lot of angry comments back from folks saying, of course, people remember Columbia. But I've asked even my relatives, I said, tell me what you remember about the Columbia accident. And they can't recall what the image was. We had that image of Challenger that's burned in everybody's mind. There is a similar type of image from Columbia that people might recognize when they see it. So I do believe that it is not as well remembered as Challenger. Part of what I also do when I give a lot of talks about Columbia is that I remind people of the context of what was going on. That we were 16 months after 9/11. We were at war in Afghanistan, and we were in the middle of debate about invading Iraq. And in fact, the day that black box was discovered was the day that we had invaded Iraq.
Wow!
And so they broke into the coverage of that bombing of Baghdad to announce that they'd found that thing. But that's why we don't remember it. To my knowledge, what was kind of embarrassing was that at the 15th anniversary commemoration service in Hemp Hill, Texas, the congressman from that district was saying, of course, we all remember what happened when Columbia was launched and it blew up after it launched and the pieces fell in Texas. And people were just like looking around each other and saying, oh my God. So, even he didn't remember exactly what had happened.
Boy.
Well, obviously you had the Christa McAuliffe effect with the Challenger disaster, which you didn't have with the Columbia one, though, right?
If I may interrupt for just a second, actually, it's funny because there were 2 other national heroes who we don't get as much recognition here in the States. Kalpana Chawla, she had a huge following in India, and of course, Ilan Ramon. There was a big backlash from Israel against the United States that we had not done enough to protect Ramon, even though we probably had more security for that launch than there had ever been for any previous or subsequent launch.
Yes, sorry, I probably meant more within the US, which is what I felt we were talking about. But of course, there is that global impact as well.
So it's nearly been 20 years since that awful morning that we learned of Columbia's breakup. Many of us woke up to that news in the United States. I don't know how Dave found it out, but it happened early in the morning here. So what do you think the biggest lesson learned is from the entire Columbia story, whether it be from launch to recovery?
Well, I think if you go back to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board report, it really is. It's about that this was as much a failure of organizational culture as it was about the hardware. That, despite NASA having learned a lot of lessons after the Challenger accident about how you have to make sure that debate happens and that people who have concerns can elevate that, over the course of 20 years, a culture begins to disintegrate and deteriorate again. And you become prey to the same pressures of maybe not explicitly launch fever, but, if you've only got so much time to get something done, we were trying to get the International Space Station completed, or the U.S. portion of it completed by the next year. And the Space Shuttle program had been grounded for several months because of technical issues. So NASA was behind the ball. We had technical issues that had cropped up. They had caused damage on previous flights, but nothing serious enough to warrant, in NASA's mind, grounding the program. And if you go back and look at it, they certainly should have grounded the Space Shuttle. 2 launches before Columbia, a piece of foam came off and dented one of the solid rocket boosters that was recovered. That was disposition to saying, hey, it survived. We got to keep pressing on. So to me, the big lesson learned from that is that you've got to find ways to step back and take a look at what kind of pressures you're putting yourself under, what kind of assumptions you're making that could be putting a program at risk. One of these things, okay, we're in such a hurry to get the space station built. We can't afford a delay to fix this problem. Okay, what happens? Then you have this accident and the space shuttle program's grounded for 2 years or 3 years, so guess what? You're late now anyway, and you've lost people's lives and you've lost a national asset.
Do you feel like NASA really has learnt those lessons now? It was interesting. I was just finally finishing off Eileen's book. I know we spoke to you about that so long ago, but I've had so many books to read and I've been working my way through it. And I feel like you and her handled that chapter brilliantly about the aftermath. But do you feel like NASA learnt from that as they go into Artemis? Obviously, we had all of the delays and they're actually taking the steps to make sure things go well. There's now a bigger time difference between the Challenger and Columbia disaster than Columbia and now. Is there a worry that they've forgotten those lessons? And maybe even if NASA hasn't forgotten them, is there a concern that the private industries which are now taking over have forgotten the lessons or do not know those lessons?
That's a great question. And, if you talk informally off the record to a lot of the NASA hands, they're all saying that they're really concerned about what's going to happen the first time SpaceX loses somebody, or Blue Origin loses somebody, or Virgin does. And Virgin did lose one of its test pilots in a test, and that kind of thing is going to happen. Space is a dangerous environment. I hope NASA has learned its lesson, but it's one of those things that you just can't do it one time and walk away from it. You have to have continued reminders and refreshing. You have to have a way for people to be able to elevate if something is not going the way it's supposed to go. How do you get that concern elevated and taken care of? People that I talk to, of course, there's the ones that you talk to who said, hey, we knew this foam was a big issue. But there's also, how many times has this same person or another person been waving the red flag 30 other times and nothing did happen as a result of that? So as a leader, it's very tough to make that kind of balancing act that, you are in fact listening to this person. You're not shutting them down if they do have a valid concern, or, we getting it checked out. That's a really tough thing to do, especially with systems that are as complex as our space program is. I hope that the private industry is taking this into account. I can't remember who it was that told me this, but he said that Elon Musk has said, if anybody on the launch team here sees any reason why we shouldn't launch, you are to get in touch with me personally immediately and let me know that, which I think is just a fantastic thing to have that come up. The problem with the Challenger accident was the launch director never even knew that there had been these concerns being raised the night before that never got elevated at all to the level of management. You just can't have things like that happening. And so it sounds to me like that at least SpaceX is hearing that, and I'm hoping that Blue Origin will be hearing that as well.
When you were writing that book with Eileen, and in particular, as I mentioned, the chapter about Columbia, I thought was really, really good. And obviously the return to flight as well. Do you know if, and I'm not expecting you to speak on her behalf or to reveal anything, but do you know if people like her or other astronauts of her class or her generation are still in contact, even if they're not at NASA, are still in contact with people there to let them know? I'm sure there are people that still work at NASA that were there, but just to remind them of the lessons that were learned.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point. We were talking about Walt Cunningham the other day, And Eileen was saying that she first met Walt Cunningham back in the 1990s. And the first thing he said to her was, you astronauts need to stop doing the PR stuff, and you need to be going to the factories, and you need to be going to the centers and talking to the people and reminding them about safety and quality. That was the thing that the Apollo astronauts, the Gemini and Mercury astronauts did, was to get personally involved like that. And I think it's helpful to have reminders like that, to have people get back in touch with the folks who are manufacturing this. One of the things that Mike Lineback talks about is, he says, and I'm getting off the question a little bit here, but Mike says that as launch director, he said, after Columbia, he said, the question I always asked myself when I saw the vehicle out there in the stack and we're going through the final countdown, am I willing to commit these 7 husbands, wives, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers? Am I willing to commit these 7 people to the most dangerous thing they've ever done in their lives? And am I absolutely sure that we're ready to go? And he said, if I didn't feel in my gut that was where we were going, I was not about to make that launch. And so I hope that we see similar types of things going on, at Blue Origin and SpaceX and things like that. I think Eileen, if asked, would be glad to go back to some of these places. I don't know that she's toured Michoud since they started, rebuilding Artemis out there. I had the great fortune to be on the astronaut bus with her at the Astronaut Hall of Fame banquet last year. We drove out to the Artemis launch pad while it was sitting there, and I have a picture of Eileen just pressed up against the window, taking a picture with her cell phone of Artemis, because I think you could just hear all the astronauts on the bus kind of going like, would you get on that? I'm not sure. I think it might be a fun ride. The consensus seemed to be that they would take the ride if it was offered to them.
Yeah, I bet.
Of course,
Yeah.
of course,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And moving on to more positive things about you, obviously you've written a number of books in the past that we're very fond of. What's next?
What would you like to see next? I'm always.
Oh, wow. Oh, my goodness. That's tough.
The last 2 books just fell into my lap. And so, it's funny because the one with Eileen just happened because of COVID. If it hadn't been for COVID, she would never have had the time to write it down. My agent doesn't want me to get pigeonholed as the writer of other people's memoirs. He thinks I need to write something on my own, which I think is a good idea, but it's, of course, tough to come up with an idea for that. I'm thinking something astronomy related. I'd like to maybe do a book about the big observatories in the world. I think would be kind of fun, like a coffee table book about those or something might be fun to do.
That would be awesome. I would definitely get that, because I don't know much about astronomy, so that would be cool.
A good way to write off some trips to the Azores, places like that, Canary Islands. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah,
There you go. Exactly.
If you don't mind, I would just like to say thank you very much to the people who supported us throughout the year. I mean, one of the things, or the last 5 years, it's been 5 years since the book came out. It's in more than 40,000 people's hands right now, which makes me extremely proud.
Wow.
We've got a feature film that's under development, which I'm really excited about. The story of unlikely heroes and strong people who fought their emotions and stepped up to a challenge. So, when I go back and think about the things that I'm most proud of in my life, this has got to be at the top of the list. I have to say my kids and grandkids, but professionally speaking, working on this book has been the best thing of my entire life. And I'm so honored and so pleased that I got a chance to do it.
When you were writing it, were you aware yourself that might be how you felt in 5 years? Did you think you might be writing an award-winning book?
I hadn't thought about that. I think I was just trying to work on it, try to pull all the stories together more than anything else. The main concern that I had, and this sounds kind of corny, but going back to the question about trying to be tasteful, after we finished the book and submitted it, I went down to Kennedy Space Center and I stood in front of Columbia's windows and the forever remembered thing. And I tried to imagine the crew looking back at me through the windows there and asking myself, did I do everything I could to tell their story and to would they be proud of what this has done? That's what I was most concerned about. And to me, the biggest fear I had was how the families were going to react to the book. And the day that I first met Evelyn Husband Thompson, she was the widow of Columbia's commander. It was the day before the 15th anniversary of the accident. And she said to me, will you autograph copies of the book for me and my kids? And to me, that was the biggest honor I could have ever possibly gotten, that she she felt that way about it. So that to me was all I cared about, was that we told the story. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming and talk to us about it. I'm sure most of our listeners probably have a copy or read it, but if they haven't, they really need to get a copy of this book. I mean,
yeah, I think I've got 2 or 3 copies.
My girlfriend gravitated towards that book. She's not a space person at all, and she was hooked. But she read the first chapter, she was absolutely hooked. And I think that's the power of this story. You mentioned 9/11, and there's some, and the fact you're making a feature film of this recovery reminds me of the musical Come From Away. Do you know about that musical? The musical about the Newfoundland island that all the planes arrived at, and inherently when people do things against the odds, or when bad things happen and people can show the true nature of humanity, I think that story is always worth telling and inspiring to find out about, whether it's through book, film, or musical theatre. I think those stories always connect with people. So thank you so much for bringing this to everyone and sharing all those stories that you managed to get into the book. I think it's wonderful.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure to talk with you all, and look forward to seeing you again sometime real soon.
Absolutely.
For me, it was very far-fetched to think I'd get to fly on the space shuttle, because I lived in India in a very small town, and forget about space, I didn't even know if my folks were going to let me go to the engineering college, and that was the immediate goal, you know.
I mean, that was just a wonderful interview. Listeners, I said it at the end there, if you've not got this book, you have to have it and read it. It's the most positive way you could remember this incident, isn't it?
It is. It really is. I said this in the interview in one of the questions, but it's oddly a very hopeful and uplifting book at the end of the book, because I don't want to spoil too much of the book for people who have not read it yet, because you definitely have to just go out and order it or go get it. But I mean, it's really a beautiful way of showing how even in the midst of this awful, frankly awful tragedy caused by negligence, these thousands of people could band together and try to make something positive from it and try to recover as much of it as possible. And I think in the end, they recovered 40% of the orbiter, which is, to me, just, it's not a miracle because it's a lot of hard work, but it seems miraculous because it's just like, that's an awful lot of a vehicle that broke up at a hypersonic speed. I mean, you got to think about that. And like Jonathan said, the portions they did get back of the vehicle were very helpful in studying, hypersonic breakups and stuff like that. So something positive did come out from this horrible tragedy. It is a very uplifting book. And again, I have to say about this book is it's not morbid. It doesn't focus on any of the unpleasant stuff. And it's not that I want to deny what happened, because I've gotten in arguments with this about people. Some people like to focus on that stuff. And I'm like, I don't see the point. To me, it's not helping the families. They don't want to think about this. They don't want to think about their loved one going through something awful. And some people disagree with me, and whatever. They can continue to disagree with me, but I feel the book is very tasteful, and it's a very great tribute to the 7 who lost their lives on it.
I agree.
And Columbia itself, the spaceship.
Yeah, because that is a weird thing, isn't it? Obviously, we mourn the lives of the crew that were lost, but we also will have memories of that space shuttle and the other crews that had flown on it and the missions it had done and the things it had achieved. And I suppose it is a weird thing to say, but we do mourn the loss of that as well, don't we?
Yeah. Hail Columbia, the space shuttle movie from the 80s. I mean, that's still like one of my top movies. Not even a space movie, but just a movie of all time, because it was just so gorgeous. The launch sequence in that movie is just, it's only beaten by the Apollo 11 movie, the launch sequence in it. I mean, it's just exquisitely beautiful, and it's just power. Like, if you turn that volume up, your speakers are going to be gone, basically, because it's so incredible. And I hate saying this because it sounds very callous, but I remember when Columbia was lost all those years ago, obviously I was upset because people had died. I don't want to make it sound like, all I cared about was the orbiter, but there was that part too that I really was like, man, that's the first shuttle. That was the one that Young and Crippen flew on back in the day. That was I wouldn't say the Pathfinder, but it was like, sort of a Pathfinder shuttle. It was the developmental shuttle. They, where they kind of figured out how to use it in space. And it's just, there is an element of, they also lost a great vehicle as well.
Yeah, for sure. I was 17 years old when this happened. And, there are those times in your life when you'll always remember where you were. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was around my friend's house, and we were there to play the new Lord of the Rings game that had just come out. And we went to turn on the TV to load up the game, and this was what was on the news. And I was just like, what? What? This can't be right. This can't be right.
Yeah.
I remember exactly where I was standing in that room and all that. I can vividly remember the sensation and the tingles down your spine of what's going on. And it will always stay with me, I think. It will always stay with me.
Yeah, I'm still getting teared up thinking about this because I can't believe it's been this long, but at the same time, it seems like yesterday because it doesn't seem like it seems like it just happened. I remember I was 25. I was getting out of the Navy like a couple months later, so I wasn't really doing much at the time. And I actually had a weekend off, and it was Saturday. And like early in the morning, I'm guessing around 9 o'clock. I'm guessing here. It's been a few years. The phone started just ringing off the hook. And I'm like, what the hell? So the first ring, I just ignored it. I was like, I'm half asleep. I was trying to sleep in. I didn't sleep a lot during the week. Usually during the week, I got up at, 4 a.m. to go to work. So I was like, I'm just going to sleep and I'm going to ignore that. Then it starts ringing again. And I'm like, okay. When it started doing it the third time, I was like, I got to pick up the phone. Something bad has happened. Like either something bad happened at the base, there's been a terrorist attack, something bad is going on. So I picked it up and my sister had left a message on my phone. It was like, hey, Em, I'm really sorry to tell you this, but something happened at the space shuttle. You need to cut on the TV. So I did, and there it was. I'm glad I heard it from my sister before I just cut the TV on and figured it out, because I think having her tell me about it kind of softened it a bit. Like, now I at least know what to expect. I knew something bad had happened, but I think I watched TV for like the rest of the day. And I think I went out that night with like friends of mine and I just didn't have it in me. Like I ended up just being like, guys, I can't do this. And I ended up just hanging out by myself in like a coffee house for the rest of the night, just sitting and drinking coffee by myself.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll never forget it. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you were very young when this happened, but it's the same thing when Challenger happened. I'll never forget that.
Yeah, see, I was 7 months old. So I think that's why, to me, in many ways, Columbia is more real because the 90s astronauts were my generation of astronauts. They're the ones that I grew up trying to find stuff out about, which was hard for me over here. But that's why I get excited by the fact we've spoken to Eileen Collins and Susan Kilrain and Mike Massimino and so on and so forth, because they're the names and the faces that I recognize from the missions and so on and so forth. To me, Challenger is something that happened in a book. I know it didn't, but do you know what I mean? That was something I read about.
It's like Apollo 1 to me. Like everything I know about Apollo 1 is from reading like Jonathan Ward. He wrote a book about the spaceports and stuff, and he actually wrote a very good kind of a breakdown of what happened during Apollo 1. So that's how Apollo 1 is to me. I really only know it from what I've read about it. I can't really say what it was like at the time, but or what it was like to hear that news, but
absolutely.
Yeah, I totally get it.
We remember the news breaking of Columbia. I would never have done for any of the other disasters. So it's certainly, I feel it a little bit, perhaps a little bit more. There's a couple of things I want to mention. A few names I just mentioned there, which made me remember this. Clay Anderson's podcast, The Ordinary Astronaut, he was one of the family escorts for the Columbia mission, STS-107. And he tells the story really well, in his book as well, of that process and what they were trying to do and what they continue to do, their relationship with the family still. And on the podcast, you hear the emotion him and his wife talk about it on the podcast. And it's one of the most moving things I've ever listened to on a podcast. So I will put a link to that in the show notes. I think it's very much worth listening to. But I recently, on audiobook, both Eileen Collins with Jonathan Ward and also Mike Massimino's book, and they both talk about where they were when they found out what they were supposed to be doing, how close they were to or weren't to the crew, their relationships with the families and so on and so forth. And every time you read something like that, every time you hear these people talk about it, it hurt. And it should have, and not that it shouldn't have done, it's no surprise that, but yes, we just spoke about how Columbia was a great spaceship, but God, those people and the families, and and again, that's why. But Bringing Columbia Home is such a great book, as I'm going to bring it back full circle there, because the respect that they had for the families, and I love that story that Jonathan told about when before it came out, going to visit the memorial at KSC and looking through that window pane and saying, "Have I done you right?" That was powerful, man. That was powerful.
Yeah. I got sand in my eyes right now thinking about that. That's One thing I do want to mention is that Mike Mullane, who was an astronaut in the 80s, he had retired by Columbia. Had been retired for a while, but he's talked about Columbia a few times in Space Hipsters, mainly because his one of his space flights, STS-27, suffered the worst foam strike with damage before STS-107, and they did re-enter successfully, but they had a gigantic hole in the shuttle, in the orbiter. I mean, just big tile strike, really bad. The pictures of it I'm like, how did they make it? I mean, just nuts. But Mike has said, back then, and I want to state that I'm not trying to, crap on NASA or anything like that, but this was how NASA operated back then as far as risk management was concerned. But he was basically saying back then the attitude was, well, oh wow, how nice. The tile system the thermal protection system is that robust that it can stand a tile strike like that. And Mike was like, what we should have been saying at the time was, look how fragile this system is. Look at this gigantic hole in the orbiter. This isn't acceptable. We need to fix this. And that's something that I always remember and it goes back to what Jonathan was talking about in management and how we look at things, how sometimes, it's easy to look at things maybe the wrong way. But I think at the time, and I want to be very specific, at the time, that was their viewpoint. Well, it's happened before. Nobody's died, and the system was robust enough to take a hit, so it should be okay. You can't really go by that. That's not really a good safety method. Even as far back as the 80s, this was a known issue, and it took a while for NASA to really get with the program on fixing that, Yeah,
not right. Just not right. I want to end this little section on something a little bit more positive. Recently, I found out that Willie McCall was the pilot on STS-107. One of his sons has become an incredible photographer and videographer who's shot Vogue covers and music videos. His name's Cameron McCall, and his work is just outrageously good. And I found this out. Someone I know who I used to teach guitar, her name is Suki Waterhouse. She released a music video, and it said directed by Cameron McCall, and I was like, McCall? There can't be many McCalls. And I clicked on it, and I was like, no way, it's actually Willie McCall's son. How cool is that? And I just thought, well played, sir. You've had a tough start to your life, but you've gone on and done something really, really good with yourself. So fair play. I like that. I think that was a positive. That's awesome. Positive thing I thought I'd just share at the end there.
I'm excited to be a test subject because I think that's how we get answers, is by studying people. And as a physician, I understand how important it is to collect data on people. This mission is just extremely exciting, and I still feel very fortunate to be assigned to this mission.
So, Emily, what's caught your eye in spaceflight since last week?
Oh, well, I think this caught everybody's eye last week in spaceflight. Buzz Aldrin turned 93. And not only did he turn 93, he got married again to a doctor. I'm probably not saying her name correctly, and I apologize, Anka Farr. So congratulations to the newlyweds. And that reminds me of the time that me and Rusty Schweikert got married in Jamaica at a Rasta ceremony. But we only were married 9 days. Sorry, Rusty. I love you, but it didn't quite work out. I still got the ring, though. So he let me keep the ring. I'm kidding. I was never married to Rusty Schweikert. I don't want that going on his Wikipedia or something like that. So. Yeah, knowing my luck.
Yeah, quote. Yeah. Episode 126, Space and Things podcast.
Yeah, I'm going to get sued by Rusty Schweikert. Like, God, Rusty's going to be like, what the hell did you do? I love you, Rusty. If you're out there listening, I love you. I'm just kidding. I love you, not in that way. So, yeah.
This Buzz story definitely caused your Space Hipsters admins a few headaches then.
Yes, it did. We had oh God, I couldn't even count. Everybody reposted it, and some of the comments were a little interesting. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to repeat some of the comments that we had to delete because they were a little crazy, but they were interesting to say the least. So yeah, that did cause us a few headaches for a few days. When the announcement flashed that he got married, I was like, oh God, we're going to have the worst night. We're going to have the worst night.
Yeah.
We're going to have the worst evening on Space Hipsters ever because like we're going to have to just get rid of a million comments that are insane. But seriously though,
93, good age.
Yeah.
Well done, Buzz.
Well done.
And if he's happy, then that's all that matters, isn't it? Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah. And I hope when I'm 93, I'm still... moving forward with my life if I'm hoping I can make it to that age. So Dave, what have you been looking at this week?
A few things, actually. I'm going to be a bit cheeky and pick more than one. However, the first of which I did put on our Twitter and Facebook. So I won't go into too much detail. And that was that Tim Peake has retired. And obviously for us UK folk, that's a big one. He's going to carry on working as an ambassador for both the UK Space Agency and ESA. And to be honest, he's been doing that job. I'll be honest, I was a bit surprised by this. Yeah. I genuinely thought we were going to see him on either a SpaceX Dragon capsule or the Starliner capsule over the next couple of years, or even do one of the Artemis launches. I was really surprised that this has happened. So the quote on Tim's Twitter was, "I've always believed in moving forward and embracing new challenges, even if you don't know what's around the corner. It keeps things interesting. My years with ESA have been a fantastic phase of my life, and I look forward to remaining part of the ESA family as an ambassador. Space is such an exciting and dynamic sector to work in, now more so than ever. It's a privilege to work with talented people who are so passionate about what they do. And as for getting back to space again, never say never."
Yeah, he could fly on one of these commercial type missions and stuff, and who knows, we might see him on the moon. You never know.
Absolutely. So yeah, that was a big story, and especially in this country, and it probably should have been bigger in this country if I'm honest. But it does make sense. There's new astronauts around and all that kind of stuff. But what really caught my eye, Emily, there was two things, and they're connected. Number one, the Saturn 1B rocket at the rest stop in Alabama. You see this story?
Yes, you've seen that rocket,
Highway
right?
65. Yeah, I have seen that rocket. Yeah, have you ever seen it? Yeah.
Yep, I've seen it.
If you drive south from Nashville on Highway 65, you will eventually reach the rest stop, and you just drive up to it. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Obviously, the Saturn 1B rocket was the rocket that was used for Apollo 7 and the 3 crewed Skylab missions and the Apollo Soyuz mission. So it's got some good pedigree. After 40 years of being at this rest stop, it's deteriorated to such a place where it's not safe for it to be standing up. So it's been moved and taken down. They think the restoration, if they can restore it at all, would cost $7 million. They're not going to spend that money. So I think this might be another thing we see scrapped, which will be a real shame because obviously there's not many of these rockets left. And this has been a landmark. People would love talking about driving past that rocket. I know loads of people used to send me photos when they were driving past it. So I know it's something that people have got fond memories of, and no one likes to see that go. But obviously, also, it's a real piece of history, and that being scrapped is never good. But obviously, these things cost money, and when push comes to shove, we'd spend the money, but we're not in control of that purse, and not enough people will spend the money.
Yeah, I don't see people donating to something like that, and it does suck because I've been to that before, and it was really cool to see, and it is a landmark. People talk about driving past it, and the rocket, on the border of Huntsville or on the border of Nashville and Alabama and all that. People talk about it, and it is sad, but at the same time, I'm like, it isn't in good shape. It's been out in the elements for 40 years. My concern is, I don't want it to hurt nobody. I wouldn't have wanted it to collapse and hurt a child or hurt an adult, just anybody in the area, that would have been pretty bad. So I understand why they took it down, even though, I'm not happy about it, but I understand why it was necessary.
For sure. Someone online this week, someone in Hipsters, was talking about the idea of just putting it in the botanical gardens in Huntsville and letting it become overgrown and a bit of an art project. Like, even that I think would be cool. I just hope it doesn't just end up in a scrap heap or completely like other things we have seen in the past. I think there is a chance for us to at least use it in some way. Yes, it will deteriorate more, but if it can be used within the community somehow, some way, I think that would be really lovely.
Oh, I agree. I think if there was a way you could at least keep it in the community somehow, that would be awesome.
There is another story which I found on the Collect Space website when I was looking up the Saturn 1B story, which has come out recently, which I'd completely missed. And this is amazing, right? I'm reading from that article now. The first US rocket stage to be discovered after its launch has landed a new home, not far from where it lifted off almost 60 years ago. The Cape Canaveral Space Force Museum on Thursday, January 19th, took delivery of the booster segment that helped launch NASA astronauts Gordon Cooper and Charles Pete Conrad on Gemini Titan 5 GT5 mission on August the 21st, 1965. The 27-foot-long, 8-meter section of the Titan II rocket first stage has been at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. The first U.S. rocket stage to be recovered after its launch has landed a new home, and I think that's really cool. So how cool is that?
Yeah, because to my knowledge, there aren't many Titan parts, like Gemini Titan II stuff. There's not a lot of that left. So that is really awesome. And plus, there's not really a lot of like launch infrastructure left from those flights, because I hate saying this, and I know you agree with me on this. So I know we're, copacetic about this. Man, nobody appreciates the Gemini program. Like,
absolutely.
Nobody appreciates that. That's one of those programs that it's like it's almost like Skylab Part 2, nobody appreciates it because it wasn't around that long, and it was like, it was between Mercury and Apollo, so it's not as glamorous, even though it is freaking glamorous as hell. I'll shut up. I get very passionate about this. I would get fired from every job I had if I just spent all day looking at Gemini photos, because they're still incredible. They're still futuristic to me. It's still like looking at all the rendezvous and stuff. I'm like, this still looks like science fiction to me, even though it happened well over 50 years ago. I mean, they're just beautiful photos.
Yeah.
So I love the fact that, coming back to the topic, I love the fact that, there's a piece of that history back where it launched back in the day. That is awesome.
These museums have only got so many resources, and the fact that they're able to keep this big bit of history preserved, I think is great. And then finding a new home from it, fantastic. So positive story, even though the Saturn rocket story is not so positive.
Thank you for listening this week. It's such a sad time of year for us, but we hope that this episode might have contained a little bit of hope through the sadness. We'll be back with more Space and Things next week.
Yeah, we're in the middle of planning our activities for the next few months, but don't worry, in space, no one can hear us skiing.
Space and Things has been brought to you by And Things Productions.